Hey guys, I'm glad you're here. Today's project is this Craftsman leaf blower, and the problem is that it's been in storage for a very long time and now it won't start. Let's see if we can find out what's wrong with it and fix it. I'm not sure how you feel about Craftsman products, but this one is very robust. The very first piece of equipment that I ever picked up off the curb from Craigslist and fixed was this model blower. So I have some really good memories with this particular model. However, after using that particular blower several times, I had a huge problem with it. It was extremely tiring to use. This model has a fairly large engine and it's too bulky to use. The fan assembly faces down, so the whole unit is extremely wide. This thing is always hitting some part of your leg. The first thing we'll do is to put some gas in it and try starting it. That way we can see what all it does or doesn't do, and then we'll go from there. And after removing the gas cap to put gas in it, we find our first problem. If you look in the gas tank, you can see a loose fuel filter. This isn't good news, as it means we'll have to change out the old rotting fuel lines. And once we get the fuel filter out of the tank, it tells a very depressing story. It's totally soaked in 2-cycle oil, so that means it was put up with a full tank of mixed gas. And that also means that the carburetor will also be caked with oil as well. Let's put some gas into the carburetor throat and try starting it. If it runs, then we can try to fix it. However, if it doesn't run, then it may not be worth fixing because the engine might be broken. Well, luckily it runs, so let's start by taking the carburetor off the engine. We'll also get to see how the fuel lines are ran so we can replace them. Well, that's not good news at all. The fuel lines disappear into the plastic housing. That means we have to completely disassemble the housing to get to the fuel tank. There are plenty of screws holding the housing together, and not to mention we also have to remove the muffler as well. I probably should have used a power tool to help get all the screws out, because by the time I got done, my hand was pretty cramped up. The good news is that the screws are all the same size, so it doesn't matter if you decide to keep them in order. Before we can split the housing apart, we also have to open up the bottom flap. I'll use a flat screwdriver to help open it. When removing the flap, be very careful not to lose the spring that keeps it closed to the housing. Now with the housings apart, you can also see how the recoil is ran. At this point, if you need to replace the pull rope, now would be a good time. If you take a good look at the exhaust port, you can see the piston, and if you rotate the engine by rotating the fan, you can see there's very little wear on the rings and the cylinder walls. This engine is in really good shape. If we take a good look at the fuel tank, you can see the fuel lines are definitely broken. It's a good thing we didn't put any gas into the tank yet. It looks like one of the fuel lines is a standard size, while the other one is a little bit smaller. Let's remove the old fuel lines from the carburetor and get them out of the way so we can make some new ones. I cut the bigger fuel line a little longer than the one that came out. This line is going to be our return line. The thinner line I cut twice the length of the bigger line. This is going to be the line for the fuel filter. To help get the lines into the tank, cut a steep angle at one of the ends of each line. Remove the tank to make this next part a whole lot easier. I'll start with the thinner fuel line. Push it into the smaller hole enough to grab it with some bent pliers. Pull it out of the tank and cut the angle piece off. Next, push the thicker line into the tank and do the same as before. This time, however, cut the angle off and insert a plastic splice. This will help you keep the return line from coming out of the tank. Now pull some of the return line back out of the tank. Next, insert the fuel filter on the smaller line. It's a bit tough to do with the thinner line, but it can be done. And after it's done, place the fuel filter into the tank. Now it's time to take the carburetor apart. Remove the top part of the carburetor where the primer bulb is. And once it's apart, we can see old gas and oil that'll need to be removed. If I remove the diaphragm and place it on the carburetor, we can see that the two check valve flaps near my thumb sit flush to the carburetor, so it's in pretty good shape to be reused. The base of the primer bulb plate has some deposits that will also need to be removed as well. Next, remove the bottom plate of the carburetor to look at the metering diaphragm. Surprisingly, the diaphragm is in pretty good shape. Let's remove it and see just how flexible it really is. Well, believe it or not, I think this diaphragm is still quite usable. Let's replace the diaphragm and put the entire carburetor back together again. I really didn't have to, but I went ahead and cleaned the outside of the carburetor of any dirt before I took the carburetor apart, that way it didn't get inside the carburetor. Now it's time to put the tank back into the housing and close up the housing. The trickiest part is reinstalling the bottom flap, as the spring is the hardest part. Next, reinstall the muffler and its cover, followed by the carburetor, but only install it by the fuel lines. Now we're going to add some fuel into the tank and then try priming the fuel system just to make sure the carburetor is working the way it's supposed to. Now press the primer bulb several times and watch the fuel come in by the smaller line into the carburetor and then leave by the larger fuel line. And since it seems to be working, let's reinstall the carb and its cover back onto the blower. And just in case we need it, this carb uses a spline carburetor tool, which is about a couple of dollars online. The adjustment screws are also on the front of the carburetor near the bottom of the cover. I'm going to show the whole startup procedure with no editing. That way you can see exactly what happened. Well, it didn't like being off choke at the beginning since it died, but after the second time it warmed up a bit, it stayed running. It could use just a bit more fuel, but it's also quite cold outside, which is affecting its fuel requirements. So do you think it was worth fixing this blower? Like I said, it's not easy to use and it's definitely a strange design by today's standards. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.